Alright, welcome to this video. We're going to talk about the history of North Africa. So one of the driving questions I want to put in your brain today is who has influenced the culture and development of North Africa? And you're going to kind of see here, it's really multiple groups that have really influenced that. You can see a couple of the learning targets we've got today. So brief overview. I'm not really going to touch on this too much because we've done a video already about the ancient Egyptians. You can see that they were kind of one of the first groups to really establish civilization and have an influence on the area. We've talked about the pyramids. We've talked about pharaohs. This is a painting of King Tut. So what's going to happen is that in the country of Lebanon, which is in Western Asia, they sail across the Mediterranean, they make it to North Africa, and they establish the city of Carthage. And you may have heard of Carthage before. It's pretty big in Roman history. They're going to go to war with Rome several times, so that's really pretty important. So this is kind of North Africa. Tunisia, I believe, is the area we're talking about of Carthage, so modern-day Tunisia. These are some of the ruins that are left of Carthage. So the main thing you need to know here is that Carthage fought against Rome in what was called the Punic Wars. There were 3 of them. I can't remember exactly how the first and second one ended, but the third one went very, very badly for Carthage. They were defeated by Rome. Rome didn't want a 4th Punic War, so they enslaved many of the people. I heard a story that they actually sowed salt into the soil. It may seem like kind of an odd thing to do, but what that does is it changed the chemistry of the soil, maybe the pH of the soil or whatever, and it made it so you couldn't grow anything. So they wanted to make sure that no group of people could live there. Eventually, though, people did settle in the area after Carthage. So the Punic Wars are kind of really important here. Romans had North Africans change religions from their indigenous religions to Christianity. At this point, Rome was kind of mainly Christian. So that's kind of an important part there. Eventually, what's going to happen, though, is there's going to be a stronger Islamic influence that's going to come in through such groups like the Berbers, and even the Egyptians are going to convert as well to Islam. So if you go to Egypt today, there's a lot of Islamic people that are there. The Arabic language is going to be really important. You can see the term there of caliph. We'll talk about that a little bit later on, which is kind of like the Islamic ruler of an area. So that's another kind of one of the important things there. Kind of moving on, eventually Portuguese and Spanish are going to kind of come in and try to take over parts of these areas. The Ottoman Empire is going to have control over parts as well. One of the things you'll learn very quickly in our study of Africa is that most of it was colonized by Europe. So you can see here Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco were under France. Then another part of Morocco was under Spanish rule. Libya was controlled by Italians, and the British controlled Egypt. So you will see a map at some point that shows you Africa, and almost all of it was colonized by Europe. It's pretty interesting as we talk about that and just the long-lasting effects that that's had on Africa. Here, we've already talked about the Suez Canal in the last video that I created. There's a video up here that you can watch if you get into the actual notes, and you can see this is an aerial view of the Suez Canal. So I believe this down here is the Red Sea, and this is the Mediterranean. So this all is man-made through here. This like long, skinny, almost like a river. That's the Suez Canal that allows ships to pass from the Red Sea, and the Red Sea opens up into the ocean. So it saves a lot of time in being able to get into Europe. Alright, so moving on here. This is kind of one of those pictures I was talking about. This picture on the far right here shows how Europe was colonized by 1913. Pretty much all those colors are representing European powers. You can see in 1880 there wasn't quite as much, but North Africa, being the closest to Europe, would have been one of the first things that was colonized. Not as many resources there they wanted to exploit, but definitely they did take advantage of that. This is kind of an interesting slide as we look through here and we see, kind of fast forwarding in history, just the independence movements that happened. A lot of this happened after World War II. A lot of European powers began to realize that having so many colonies was not necessarily a good thing, especially during a world war, and it was hard to remain control of those areas if there's other areas that are after them. So you can see here, a lot of them did not have peaceful revolts. You can see Egypt, Algeria, and Libya all had problems. This term coup here, that's not pronounced coupe, like a chicken coop or a car, called a coupe. This is called coup, even though it has a P in it. Basically, a coup is where the military goes in and takes over the government. And then usually, maybe like the leader of the military becomes the next leader. If you studied last year Cuba and Fidel Castro took over Cuba through a coup. So it's not necessarily a good thing if you are a proponent of democracy, since it is not an election of any kind. So just you can see here that these countries have gone through a lot of struggle for independence. This is another common theme that you will see throughout Africa, is that a lot of countries end up going through these political struggles for independence. The Arab Spring is one of those terms that you probably need to know. It's a series of demonstrations and protests that happened from 2010 to 2012, so a little bit more recent in our study of history. A lot of it, I think, was more of a call for stricter Islamic principles applied to government and society. So a lot of people were calling kind of for that, and that's what the Arab Spring is. Here again, this just kind of goes through and talks about some of the issues that countries are struggling with. Algeria, you can see that there's some problems with unrest from these Islamic political groups. We'll talk about ISIS later on. I think ISIS has even had an influence on some of these areas. Syria is in the Middle East, but I think a lot of the fighting has trickled down into North Africa. Libya's had a dictatorship. Tunisia struggled with human rights. So Africa certainly has its list of issues that it has struggled with. And I would kind of make this claim now, but I think a lot of it comes from the fact that Europe dominated the country for so long, the continent for so long. And once Europe decided to leave, there wasn't structure, there wasn't the kind of education and all those things that create a good society present. And so then you have a lot of conflict that happens. And so that's one of the things that I think is important to know, is that Africa isn't at war just because these people can't get along, but because of things that were done to those people over a long period of time. You can see here again, Egypt and Morocco have also kind of struggled with issues. So definitely a lot of conflict that's happened in North Africa. I mentioned before, I think in my first video, that a lot of people are fleeing and trying to cross the Mediterranean to get to Europe. You'll see some pictures of that in class. So I think that's our last slide. So one of the things I want you to kind of think about here is like what groups have had influence here, and you'll see a lot of the influence has come from the Middle East, has come from countries like Iraq, Iran, that we'll talk about later on. There is a European influence since they controlled it, but really I think since much of it is Arabic speaking, much of it is Islamic, the influence kind of mainly falls from Western Asia in those Middle Eastern countries that we won't talk about for a while. So kind of leave you with that, but I think that's where kind of a lot of the history and what we're going to talk in the next video segment is more of the current situation in North Africa. So thanks for tuning in.